We're starting. Hi, good morning. I'm Andrea from Piandre. Thank you for accepting this invitation to be here this morning. Just a few things. There's a chat button below where you can write your comments. We might not have time for questions, but we can flash Sir Bob's email later on if you would like to reach out to him. On the first week of the quarantine, we had a Lenten talk by Father Francis Alvarez from the Society of Jesus. It was received so well among our clients and friends that we were inspired to do it again. Today, we are blessed to have as our speaker an Atenean legend in Dr. Roberto Guevara. Sir Bobby Gev is a professor of theology at Ateneo de Manila University. He was the recipient of the 2012 Henry Lee Irwin Memorial Teacher Award, which honors teachers who have shown excellence in their profession and service to the Filipino youth. His class in Ateneo is the class you take as a graduating senior that involves immersing in the less privileged sectors of society. Sir Bob is a testament to the Ignatian ideals that he lives by and that guides his formation work among his students. Without further ado, I turn over to the floor to Sir Bobby Guevara.
Thank you so much, Drea. Thank you for this opportunity to actually be with you this morning. I wanted to say good morning to everyone viewing and listening in. I hope the points I plan to share with you in the coming 80-90 minutes will be of some help as we reflect on our individual and collective journeys. I entitled this presentation on Journeys and Crossroads, Reflections on Exodus and the Story of Our Lives. Why choose the story of the Exodus? I think a number of us already know that in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, the fundamental narrative is the story of the Exodus. That Israel's faith springs forth from the foundational experience of Exodus. I tell people it will be difficult to understand the other parts of the Bible unless we see it from the perspective of the Exodus. And what's the Exodus? It's the story of a people's journey from slavery and death to freedom and life. The story of Exodus is not just Israel's story. In many poor communities, in Christian contexts, one of the favorite biblical narratives of poor communities, of basic Christian communities, is the story of Exodus. The story of enslaved people journeying towards freedom. So Exodus is also the story of many poor communities in Christian contexts. In 1986, right after the EDSA revolution, there were some theologians who wrote about the EDSA experience as the Philippine version of the Exodus narrative, drawing parallels between the Pharaoh in Exodus and the dictator, between slavery in Egypt and martial law, as well as between Israel's marching out of Egypt and crossing the sea, and the Filipino experience in EDSA, where both the Israelites and the Filipinos marched out in freedom with their newfound faith in song. So Exodus is Israel's story, yes, but it's also the story of poor communities journeying towards freedom. it's also the story of our beloved Philippines. No? And I think for the next 80 or 90 minutes, what I also want to propose to all of us is that Exodus is likewise the story of each and every one of us. Exodus is also your story. And I think it would be helpful to try to reflect on Exodus as your story on multiple levels. No? It is your story as an individual. It is your story as a person in relationship. If you are spouse, if you are son, daughter, if you are father, mother, it is also your story as a member of a particular organization or institution. It's also your story as a Filipino. It's also your story as a global citizen. So for us to hopefully reflect on the points that will be shared in light of those multiple levels. So let's begin the story. What's episode 1? Episode 1, hashtag slavery. And this is what you see in the biblical narrative. The Israelites are in Egypt, and the text will say they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. So they made the people of Israel serve with rigor and made their lives bitter with hard service. Bricks, bricks, bricks. They're born into slavery. They die as slaves. And oftentimes, when I give this presentation to a live audience, I ask people, so did they like the slavery? And 100% of the time, understandably, the answer I receive from the audience is, of course not. Of course not. And then I counter with a follow-up question. But how do we explain the fact that Israel's slavery lasted for more than 100 years? They might not have liked the slavery, but how do we explain the fact that Israel's slavery lasted for more than 100 years? And I think that brings us to the first insight for this morning. And the insight is, you might not like slavery, but after a while, you get used to it. You might not like slavery, but after a while, you get used to it. Some of us might say, we didn't like Spanish colonization, but it lasted for 300 years. Many of us might say we didn't like martial law, but it lasted for 2 decades. There are many things in our lives which we don't like, but in a way we've gotten used to already. You might look at this insight and say, okay, so I understand what the insight is saying, but what does that have to do with me? So what follows are quotes from psychology and from spirituality, which I hope can provide us some further points for reflection. This first quote comes from a Jungian psychologist named James Hollis. And James Hollis says, no one awakens in the morning, looks in the mirror and says, I think I will repeat my mistakes today. Or I expect that today I will do something stupid, repetitive, regressive, and against my best interests. But frequently, this replication of history is precisely what we do, because we are unaware of the silent presence of those programmed energies, the core ideas we have acquired, internalized, and surrendered to. Chances are we all woke up today and said, today is a brand new day. No? It's a brand new day. And yet Hollis is saying, at a certain point, we simply repeat history. No? In fact, in a subsequent quote, he has this to say: we have constructed patterns in our lives, patterns in relationships, patterns at work, and so often self-defeating patterns which undermine our best interests. There is always a logical connection between a surface symptom or pattern and a historic wounding to the soul. So James Hollis, the Jungian psychologist, is saying that at a certain point in our lives, we live out patterns. Same old, same old. No? We might have internal scripts in our minds and in our hearts that are self-defeating. Scripts like, I'm not good enough. No? There might be patterns in our relationships that we simply repeat day in and day out. No? There might be patterns at work in the organizations that we're part of. There might be patterns that we simply replicate in society as Filipinos, as global citizens. No? And in a way, it's the same pattern day in and day out, day in and day out. There might be aspects of this that we don't like, but in a way, we've gotten used to already. Here is a quote from Pope Francis, where he says, we have to empty ourselves of the many small or great idols that we have. They can be ambition, careerism, a taste for success, placing ourselves at the center, the tendency to dominate others, the claim to be the sole masters of our lives, some sins to which we are bound, and many others. I chose this quote because I think here is an example of Pope Francis trying to name some of the unfreedoms, some of the various forms of slavery that we might have gotten used to already. And that might, in a sense, have enslaved us. No? It's been a month since the ECQ was put in place. And there's been a lot of time to be with oneself. No? And here is a quote from Eric Clayton. He has this Ignition digital retreat from a pandemic. And he was saying this in light of the pandemic and the time that we have with ourselves. No? He says, here in our pandemic caves, the distractions of our daily routines have been removed. It is often in a moment of crisis that we come face to face with who we are, and we glimpse what lurks beneath the surface of our interior lives. Now we have to search our own hearts to discover where God is trying to work within us. Otherwise, we might end up allowing our own inner demons to manipulate our emotions, our relationships, and our daily lives. Apart from the busyness that has kept us distracted for the longest time, I think the past month has really forced us to stay home and to, in a sense, come home to ourselves, and to deepen our understanding of who we are. There's just no way running around that. No? And I think this invitation to search our own hearts and to discover where God is trying to work within us begins with an awareness of our unfreedoms. No? And I don't think this is meant to actually pull us down, to bring us to a dark place. I don't think that's the point behind this invitation. No? Father Mon Bautista will say that for Ignatius of Loyola, the ridding of our disordered attachments is most indispensable because we simply cannot seek, find, and do God's will in our lives if we are not free enough from our disordered tendencies. With much unfreedom in us, we will never be able to do serious discernment, and we will just continue to be at the mercy of our attachments. If you go through this quote, you'll find a number of synonyms, no? Disordered attachments, disordered tendencies, unfreedom. No? I think all these are synonyms, no? And they will say that we have attachments, we have tendencies. Many of these are fine, but we also have attachments and tendencies that are disordered, that are out of sync, that are unhealthy, and that hinder our living life more fully, no? More meaningfully. That we have unfreedoms, we have various forms of slavery that, in a sense, hinder our discernment and our choosing of the good consistently. So I think the point is simply this, no? An awareness of our unfreedoms, our Egypts, our disordered attachments and disordered tendencies is not meant to bring us to a dark place and to pull us down. Rather, this awareness is important so that we can discern and choose more freely, more deeply, more lovingly. So this awareness of our unfreedoms is a path towards discerning and choosing more freely, more fully, more lovingly. So episode 1, hashtag slavery. Again, if this were a live talk, my next question to the group would be, so they lived in slavery for more than 100 years. No? When does change become possible in the story of the Exodus? And I want to point you to a particular text that talks about the Israelites crying out. And this is the text in Exodus 2. And it says, "And the people of Israel groaned under their bondage and cried out for help. And God heard their groaning." The crying out is important because without the crying out, you just end up going back to Egypt. You just end up reliving the pattern. No? And I emphasize this because, I don't think many of us are comfortable with the crying out. When I think about it, when a friend is crying or grieving, what do we usually tell that person? We tell that person, tahan na, stop crying. We say things will be okay. We say you can handle this, kaya mo yan. We say I understand even if we don't. And sometimes we actually even say, God has a plan. Someone is crying and we say one or all of those five things. And I've always wondered whether that person who is crying has every right to turn to us and tell us, if you were my friend, can you simply accompany me in my grieving? Can you simply allow me to weep? And I think there's something there. I think the crying out is important because the people's groan of pain is not merely an expression of misery. It is also a complaint, a protest, an acknowledgement that things are not right. It is the first sign of openness to the new and hopeful expectation that slavery is not the last word. To cry out is to, in a sense, believe that the slavery one experiences is not the final word. And this leads us to our second insight for the morning. I borrow this from a Jewish author named Aviva Zornberg, and she says the basic requirement of freedom is the awareness of exile, the groan of conscious alienation. Before one can be free, one has to be aware, one has to know that one is not free. Bago makalaya ang isang tao, kailangang malaman muna niya, kailangan mamalayan muna niya na hindi siya malaya. Here's a quote from Chris Lowney. He says, as Ignatius of Loyola observes, the enemy of human nature does fear discovery. While our weaknesses remain unacknowledged or closeted away, we are powerless over them. The sometimes painful process of dragging our weaknesses into full light of day by understanding them is the first empowering stride toward conquering them. They say that in the spiritual life, one of the temptations of the evil spirit is to tell us to keep things in secret, to keep things in the dark. This quote is saying that change begins when we are able to bring things out of the dark and into the light. When we name our slavery, when we express our slavery, when we acknowledge our slavery. And I think that's what Israel does. I'm thinking about groups that help people heal from addictions. For instance, Alcoholic Anonymous, and they would have their 12-step process for healing. And if you recall the first step, without which all the other steps would not be possible, what's step one? Step one is for someone to actually go before a group and say, my name is so-and-so, and I admit that I am an alcoholic. And I admit that my life has become unmanageable because of my addiction to alcohol. Step one, to name, to acknowledge my unfreedom. And without that, all the other steps will not be possible. So I think the crying out is important. if you think about it, there are 150 psalms, and the most numerous type of psalms would be psalms of lament. Psalms of lament. You know, Israel had an insight that the crying out was important. I share with you at this point a poem by Joyce Rupp. It's entitled Prayer for Midlife Grieving. And in this poem, Rupp reflects on life and the losses of life. And her basic image here is this image of us sitting with open hands. No? The gesture of not having anything else to hang on to. No? Compassionate one, I sit with empty hands, wondering about the losses of my life. I sit with empty hands, pondering the pain of many goodbyes. I sit with empty hands, searching for decisions about difficult choices. I sit with empty hands, facing the limitations of my aging. I sit with empty hands, looking for my life among the broken pieces. I sit with empty hands, sifting through dreams that have disintegrated. I sit with empty hands, feeling the ache and sorrow of all my losses. I sit with empty hands, yearning for the unfolding of my true identity. Compassionate one, I sit with empty hands, trusting that your presence embraces my pain, shelters my vulnerability, and gives meaning to my countless dyings. I am able to sit with empty hands and cry out because there's a part of me that believes that someone is listening. That someone is listening. So the crying out. I share with you now some recent quotes from Pope Francis shared during the pandemic. No? This was March 29. No? And Pope Francis says, I am thinking of the many people who are weeping, people who are isolated, in quarantine, the elderly, people who are alone in the hospital, parents who do not foresee receiving their salary and do not know how they will feed their children. Many people are weeping. We too, from our hearts, accompany them. And then Pope Francis goes on and says this to us. Am I capable of weeping, as Jesus would certainly have done and does now? Is my heart like Jesus's? And if it is too hard, even if I can speak and do good in order to help, if my heart isn't entering in and I am not capable of weeping, ask the Lord for this grace. Lord, that I might weep with you, weep with your people who are suffering right now. Pope Francis is inviting us to pray for the grace of tears. Of tears. Have you been moved to tears the past month? Can we pray for that grace? That we might weep with the Lord, weep with God's people who are suffering right now. Jesus wept for his dear friend Lazarus. Jesus wept when he saw Jerusalem and his beloved people from a distance. Jesus wept. Why pray for the gift of tears? For Evagrius, one of the church fathers, tears have an initial essential meaning. They are the acknowledgement that one needs to be saved, that one cannot go it alone. To weep is to acknowledge that one needs to be saved. And I think that's where Israel found herself in. When Israel groaned and cried out, Israel had reached a point where it acknowledged that they needed to be saved. And I think that's what we also feel in the context that we all find ourselves in. The realization that the human race is not omnipotent, that a virus can knock us down, that we need to be saved. But tears also have a second meaning. They are like water that falls on a hard rock and over time manages to penetrate it. They are like water that flows over the shell of our stony heart so that it might become a heart of flesh. Little by little, they will transform our heart so as to make it docile to the Lord. I was talking to this friend of mine, and he was saying, Bobby, I've shed tears almost every day the past month. He says, I find myself just being moved to tears, almost daily, partly out of fear, partly out of anxiety, mostly because of my being touched by what I see people do for one another. And then I asked this friend of mine, so how does this frequent crying affect you? And then he said, I actually find the tears shaping my heart. Weeks into this pandemic, I find myself more humble. I find myself more compassionate. I find myself more loving. And when I remember what this friend of mine told me, I remember this quote that we just read. The tears are like water that flows over the shell of our stony hearts, so that they might become hearts of flesh. Little by little, they will transform our hearts so as to make it docile to the Lord? Can we pray for tears, acknowledging that we need to be saved and praying for the grace so that our hearts can be transformed into hearts that are humble, hearts that are more compassionate, hearts that are more trusting, hearts that are more loving? So episode 1, hashtag slavery. Episode 2, hashtag the cry. Now we want to enter into the third episode in the Exodus narrative. Once again, whenever I give this talk to a live audience, at this point I ask people, so sino ang bida sa Exodus? No? And 100% of the time, the answer I get from people is Moses. No? Is Moses. No? So I'll get to Moses in a few seconds. But before we enter into Moses' life, I just want to make this point. No? And I usually tell audiences I get to talk to, there would be no Moses and there would be no Exodus if not for 5 women. If not for 5 women. If you follow the story of the Exodus, there will be the 2 Hebrew midwives named Shifra and Pua. They're ordinary midwives and they disobey the Pharaoh's command, no? To actually have the newborn sons killed. No? They defy the Pharaoh's order. So they're the first 2 women, no? Who are heroines. No? The third is Moses' mother, who wraps him, places him in a basket, lets that basket flow down the river. The fourth woman is the princess, the daughter of the Pharaoh, who knew her father's order and yet chose to actually adopt Moses. The fifth woman is Miriam, Moses' sister, who actually made the arrangement to have Moses be nursed by his mother. No? So 5 women. 5 women make Moses and the Exodus possible. So I just wanted to put that out there. I suppose as you follow the goings on in light of this pandemic, we recognize also how women become life-giving channels in the midst of this pandemic. From frontliners to world leaders to women at home. It's the resiliency of the women who make liberation and giving life possible. So, the women. And then there is Moses. And then there is Moses. No? So let's enter into Moses, no? And Moses' life. I draw this from a book by Cardinal Carlo Martini, no? Where he identifies 3 periods in Moses' life. No? And he says he's basing this from the text of the Acts of the Apostles. And if you take a look at chapter 7, verses 20 to 22 in your own free time, Cardinal Martini will say, what was the first period in Moses' life? It's the period where God prepares him for a special mission. This text in Acts 7 will point to Moses being the object of God's special providence. No? He is saved, he's given a select education, he is introduced into all the richness of human culture. No? He is trained to speak and act. No? And then what happens after that is when he was 40 years old, Moses steps out of the palace for the first time. And then he sees an Egyptian maltreating an Israelite. And he takes up the defense of the Israelite and ends up killing the Egyptian. And then the next day, again, he goes out of the palace, and then he sees two Israelites arguing, and he tries to mediate and help settle the argument. And one of the Hebrews turns to Moses and says, I mean, who are you? What are you trying to do here? Will you do to us what you did to the Egyptian whom you killed yesterday? And then Moses realizes that what he had done the day prior was known all around. So he flees. No, he flees into the wilderness. And Cardinal Martini says this is the second period in Moses' life, a period of generosity that ends up in failure. And Cardinal Martini says this: having left a privileged position, Moses is now ostracized, rejected by his own people. From now on, Moses is nothing but an impoverished, frightened man. Moses settled down to look for a quiet little place where he could forget the past. So he settles down. He has a family, he has two sons. He settles down, decides to forget the past. And what was the third moment? He spends 40 years in the wilderness. So according to the tradition, at this point, Moses is already 80 years old. And what happens when he is 80? God breaks into his life. Cardinal Martini would say, I would call this the moment of discovery of the divine initiative in his life. Moses has arrived at the threshold of truth. Cardinal Martini would say, if there was one question he would be interested to ask Moses if ever he had the chance to see Moses, Cardinal Martini says, the question he would ask Moses would be, I mean, Moses, what did you do in the wilderness for 40 years? And this is the context of this next point. Cardinal Martini says, Moses himself would have answered our questions as follows. What did I do for 40 years in the desert? I accepted the solitude. I even chose it. And I suppose while the past month is not equal to 40 years, I think the past month has been a period of solitude. Whether you like it or not, the past month has been a period of solitude. Solitude, Cardinal Martini would say, possesses a fundamental value for everyone. There is a moment in which we come to realize that nothing has really satisfied us, that all our theories, experiences, and hopes have brought us satisfaction only to a certain degree. There still remains a void that only God can fill. And I think we can agree to this not just on a personal level, but even on a larger macro societal global level. And then Cardinal Martini ends with this particular point. Moses lets all his disappointment, pain, and anger rise to the surface without suppressing anything, facing it all, because he is not afraid to look into his life. Now Moses is in prayer, humbly asking, Lord, what does all this mean? Why did you let things come to this pass? If you will, please let me know. Lord, what does all this mean? And I think many, if not all of us, are also asking that question. Lord, what does all this mean? And I think it's not just in reference to what's happening outside of us. No? I think this question is also in reference to what's happening within us. Lord, what does my life mean? What does my life mean? To close Cardinal Martini's reflections, he says this: Moses represents God's effort to liberate us by bringing our authenticity to play, by repeatedly casting us into the boiling cauldron of the Spirit that loosens our rigidity and shakes our conditioning, enabling us to approach everything anew with a pliable and free spirit. Moses found himself with nothing else to hold on to. And there he encountered God. And there Moses found himself. And I wonder whether you can say the same thing about all of us this past month, when all the trappings that we've held on to slowly disappear, where we are faced with the truth of who we are, to rediscover our authenticity. And all of this brings me to the third insight for this morning. In Moses's and in our own life experiences, God calls each of us to the vocation of freedom. At this point in our lives, are you more free? Or are you more enslaved? And this insight is saying that the invitation is the invitation to move towards greater freedom. And similar to what we did in the first few points, we will have some quotes from psychology and from spirituality to accompany our reflections. Once more from James Hollis, the Jungian psychologist, he says, our vocation, that is our calling, is that to which the soul summons us. Yes, we need to earn a living, support ourselves and those who depend on us. But there is another call to serve, a summons to serve spiritual enlargement. And that is our true vocation. I mean, for Hollis, the question is, what is it that enlarges your soul? What is it that enlarges your soul? In fact, he suggests that when you are about to discern and decide on doing something, he says, it might be a helpful question to ask. This thing I am thinking about doing, will it enlarge or will it diminish my soul? And he says, that might be a helpful question to ask. And then he goes on to say, we are called to be in the modern world in a way that is both productive and nurturing. And we are called to monitor our inner lives, which is the secret source of the wisdom for better choices. We face the twin tasks of nurturance and empowerment. And again, I think at this point, James Hollis is putting before us two sets of questions. The first set will ask, at this point in your life, do you feel nurtured? Do you feel empowered? The other set of questions is, at this point in your life, are you a source of nurturance? And are you a source of empowerment for others? So two sets of questions. Do you feel nurtured? Do you feel empowered at this point in your life? And are you a source of nurturance? And are you a source of empowerment for others at this particular point in your life? Because I think your answers to those questions can lead you closer to what vocation means. No? Pope Francis will say this, that God calls us to make definitive choices. And God has a plan for each of us. To discover that plan and to respond to our vocation is to move toward personal fulfillment. I think regardless of age, whether you're in your 20s or you're in your 70s, 80s, I think regardless of age, at one point in our lives, we all ask the question, Lord, so what does all of this mean? Why am I alive? Why was I created? What is the meaning of my life? I think that's what Moses had to grapple with in discovering his vocation. And I think that's what each and every one of us is invited to actually grapple with as well. As we listen to God's continuous invitation for us to live our lives more fully, more freely, more lovingly. But Pope Francis adds this very, very, very important point. He says the Christian vocation, rooted in the contemplation of the Father's heart, inspires us to solidarity in bringing liberation to our brothers and sisters, especially the poorest. Remember our third insight? God calls each of us to the vocation of freedom. This quote of Pope Francis is saying that the question before us is not just, at this point in my life, am I more free? An equally important question that we have to ask is this: are others, especially the poorest among us, more free because I exist, because of me? So the question is not just, am I more free? The question is also, are the poor also more free because of us? You know, one thing I've heard so often the past month is, given the pandemic, given the lockdown, the poor will be the most vulnerable. But we've known that for decades. We've known that for decades, and we've failed to respond to that for decades. And I think here is an urgent, urgent invitation to reclaim this truth as part of our vocation. Not just for us to be free, but also for us to help others become more free. Not just for us to find our lives, but also for us to be life-giving to others. Here's a quote which many of my college students love. It's from Frederick Buechner. And he says, what's vocation? It's the intersection between your deep gladness and the world's deepest hunger. That God calls us to the place where our deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. What's our vocation? Picasso will say, the meaning of our lives is to find our gifts. The purpose of our lives is to give it away. And when I look at this quote, I honor all those who have offered their lives to keep all of us safe, to honor all those who continue to place themselves in harm's way to keep all of us safe. And I think we honor their lives by doing everything possible to ensure that their deaths caused by lack, the lack of planning, the lack of prioritizing. We honor their lives by ensuring that those lacks, those lapses, those failures will be addressed so that they no longer take additional lives. So vocation. I end this first part with quotes from Joyce Rupp, and she says, the first half of life has been focused on the external part of self, work, raising a family, and or forming significant relationships, making money, being successful, living our dreams to be someone. While these are important, Joyce Rupp will say the second half of life is meant to take us inward. It is here at the core or center of who we are that we explore the immense and elusive truth of the self. This journey holds its own perils and travails, but it is meant for us if greater wholeness is to be found. This journey is a journey towards wholeness. At this point in your life, are you more whole? And I think part of being whole is acknowledging one's giftedness, but also being aware of one's woundedness, one's brokenness, and being able to live with both the giftedness and the woundedness. Surrendering that to God and allowing God to fill up the lack and make use of us to give life to ourselves and to others. I think that's what vocation is. If this were a recollection, a half-day recollection or a 2.5-day retreat, I usually end this part by inviting people to a number of reflection questions. And I share them as well with you for your consideration in your quiet time outside of this presentation. How would you describe your inner journey these past years? You might actually even want to limit that to the past month. No? How would you describe your inner journey this past month? What name or symbol or image would you give it? Take time to recall the more significant lights and shadows of your journey. Whether the journey of your life these past years or whether the journey of this past month. Reflecting upon your life, how do you feel about the calling that you have responded to and pursued? How do you feel about the vocation that you've committed your life to up till this point? And third, what would you consider the Egypt that enslaves you? What might be your unfreedoms? What might be your disordered attachments or disordered tendencies? How do these affect you? Your relationships, your work, as well as your life. So some points for reflection to deepen our appropriation of the first part. I will now move on to the second part, which will be shorter than the first part. And we will follow the story. We ended the first part. Episode 3 was the call, vocation. And if you recall the story after Moses' experience in the burning bush, after he says his yes to the Lord, which took place after he objected 5 times, he returns to Egypt. And you would have him going to the Pharaoh and telling the Pharaoh, the God of Israel says, let my people go. And the Pharaoh responds and says, who is this God? No, I will not let the Israelites go. And you will have the plagues taking place. No? Plague 1 all the way up till the 10th plague. And then after the 10th plague, what happens is the Pharaoh decides to let the Israelites go. So the Israelites finally march out of Egypt. They march out and they end up encamping beside the sea. So this is where we are as far as the story is concerned. We are in Exodus 14, where Israel has left Egypt and is now encamped by the sea. And then what happens? The Pharaoh, Egypt, changes its mind. And the biblical text will say, the Pharaoh, the Egyptians will ask, what is this that we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? Again, if this was a live presentation, I would ask the group, is it only Egypt that changed its mind? And we know the answer. No, because Israel also changed its mind. They turned to Moses and they asked Moses, is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Israel changes its mind. They're encamped by the sea, but they end up asking Moses, what is this that you have done? Why did you bring us here? Didn't we tell you that it would have been better to remain in Egypt? We would be slaves, but at least we would have been alive. So Egypt changes its mind, the Israelites change their minds, which begs the question, why did they miss one another? In Filipino, I usually tell people, nagkahiwalayan na. Bakit pa nila na-miss yung isa't isa? They had already parted ways. Why did they suddenly miss one another? No? Maybe we can begin answering that question by taking a look at Egypt. And I think the answer is fairly obvious. No? Why did Egypt miss the Israelites? Because they no longer had slaves. They no longer had people to order around. They no longer had people to clean after their own mess. Ang hirap pala not to have slaves, no? Not to have servants. No? Father Jean-Louis Ska will say the reason for the nostalgia on the part of Egypt is to secure the satisfaction of their needs. Egypt is a limited world, focused on the level of needs. Thus, there is no space for freedom born beyond the mere level of needs. I think that's fairly easy to arrive at, no? When you think about why Egypt changed its mind. I think a more difficult question is, why did Israel change its mind? Why did it suddenly long for Egypt? And to answer that question, I think you have to imagine yourself as part of the scene. Earlier, we said that Israel was now encamped by the sea. And then what happens? Israel looks back. What do they see? They look back and they see the Egyptians pursuing them. What do they feel? They're afraid. They look in front of them. What do the Israelites feel? Well, they see the sea. They see the waters. What do they feel? They feel afraid. So they look behind them, they're afraid. They look in front of them, they're afraid. All around them, there's fear. Is it therefore possible that Israel longs for Egypt because it is afraid? It is afraid of what lies behind them, namely the Egyptians, but it is also afraid of what lies in front of them, namely the waters, the sea, and the desert. Which brings us to the fourth insight for this morning. And I acknowledge Father Benny Calputura, this brilliant Jesuit whom I learned so much from. No? And I remember him telling us once, you know what makes change so difficult is fear. And he went further and said, if you want to live in mediocrity, then live in fear. Then live in fear. So fear, something that all of us have not been immune from this past month. No? Something that all of us have not been immune from all our lives. So once again, insights from psychology and from spirituality. James Hollis, fear governs so much of our lives. Standing up to our fear is perhaps the most critical decision necessary in the governance of life. One of the most common ways fear can be in charge will be found in our flight from personal responsibility. The other byproduct of fear is lethargy, forgetting that we are summoned by each moment to make life-defining choices is rather easy to do. All of us are afraid, especially in the context of this pandemic. In the face of this fear, you have some people hoarding goods, hoarding stuff. You have some people exposing themselves irresponsibly and putting so many others in danger, in harm's way, and not taking responsibility and accountability for those acts. So you have those types of people reacting to their fear in those ways. On the other hand, you have other people who I am sure are also fearful, who day in and day out decide to put their lives in harm's way to save others. You have people doing small, simple acts to actually help in life-giving ways. We're all afraid, but people react in different ways. Some flee from personal responsibility, allow lethargy to take over, and choose to take on actions that are self-serving. Others face their responsibility, acknowledge that their choices are life-defining, and decide to actually spend their energy and their precious time to give life to others. They say that one of the weapons of the evil spirit is to implant fear in our hearts. Because the moment we are fearful, we end up living mediocre lives. Pope Francis will say there is a temptation that says it is better to stay here, where I am safe. Well, in the context of the ECQ, it's really better to stay home. No, but he will say, but this is the slavery of Egypt. I fear moving forward. I'm afraid of where the Lord will bring me. Fear, however, is not a good counselor. Where is the Lord inviting you in your current context for you to move forward and to not allow the fear to paralyze you? How are you being invited? There's this wonderful, wonderful quote from Pope Francis. No? in his homily, a few weeks ago. He says, in these days, there's so much suffering. There's a lot of fear. The fear of the elderly who are alone and don't know what would happen. The fear of those who don't have regular jobs and are thinking about how to feed their children. They foresee they may go hungry. The fear of many civil servants. At the moment, they're working to keep society functioning and they might get sick. There's also the fears of each one of us. Each one knows what their own fears are. We pray to the Lord that He might help us to trust and to tolerate and conquer these fears. Can we bring these fears before the Lord? And I think Moses understood Israel's fear. That's why he would say in this text, fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which He will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be still. I deliberately underlined the word see, because you will have to remember what we said earlier. What caused Israel's fear? What they looked at. They looked behind them, they saw the Egyptians, they were afraid. They looked in front of them, they saw the sea, they saw the waters, they were afraid. What caused Israel's fear? Was what they looked at. Was what they saw. No? Moses is telling them, do not look at the sources of your fears. Change what you are looking at. Rather than look at the sources of your fears, look at what the Lord will do for you today. That's what you look at. In leadership studies, we talk about revisioning, changing what we look at or how we look at things. I think that's exactly what Moses is doing in this text. Do not look at the sources of your fears. That's why, for me, the fifth insight for this morning is this. To lead involves helping oneself and others see things in a new light. To see ourselves in a new light. To see our fellow human beings in a new light. To see nature in a new light. To lead involves helping oneself and others see things in a new light. Here is a quote from Nelson Mandela where he says, "May your choices reflect your hopes, not your fears." I mean, come to think of it, it's the same act of looking. I mean, it's the same act of looking, but at every point, we have a choice. We can look at our fears or we can look to our hopes. Mandela and Moses are saying, look to your hopes. Look to your hopes, not to your fears. There's this lovely quote I came across. It's from Miriam Greenspan, and she has this to say about fear. You know, fear is a very powerful emotion. When you feel fear in your body, it's helpful to relate to it as an energy that can be mobilized for life. It may feel like a constriction in your chest, throat, or abdomen. Breathe through it without judgment and allow yourself to feel it as a very strong force. If you pray for help, you can begin to expand this energy we call fear and use it for healing and transformation. So to mobilize this fear for life, use it for healing and transformation. And then Greenspan continues. Our only protection is our interconnectedness. This has always been the message of the emotions when they are experienced most deeply and widely. Grief is not just my grief. It is the grief of every motherless child, every witness to horror in the world. Despair is not just my despair. It is everyone's despair about life in the 21st century. Fear is not just my fear. It is everyone's fear of anthrax, of nuclear war, of truck bombs, of airplane jackings, of things falling apart, blowing up, sickening and dying. Of this pandemic, no? Hindi lang ako ang takot. It is not only my fear. And then Greenspan ends with this. If fear is only telling you to save your own skin, there's not much hope for us. But the fact is that in conscious fear, there is a potentially revolutionary power of compassion and connection that can be mobilized en masse. This is the power of fear. Our collective fear, which is intelligent, is telling us now, find new ways to keep this global village safe. Find new forms of international cooperation that will root out evil in ways that don't create more victims and more evil. Leap out of the confines of national egos. Learn the ways of peace. This will take all of our creative power and ingenuity, as much and more as the intelligence and power we have put into constructing smart bombs and nuclear warheads. Can we let this collective fear turn into compassion and connection so that we can dream of something new, so that we can hope for and work together towards an alternative future? Can we look to our hopes rather than to our fears? And then what happens in the story? There's this text where it says that the cloud moved. And just to simplify what this text is saying, before, the layout was that the Egyptians were pursuing the Israelites, and then you had the cloud separating the Israelites and the sea. And then now, because the cloud moved, the text is saying that the layout was you had the Egyptians separated from the Israelites by the cloud, and then you had the sea. What might all of this mean? I think we've come to the most important part of this presentation. And I invite you to go back to what we said earlier. The Israelites were encamped by the sea. They looked behind them, they saw the Egyptians. What did they feel? They were afraid. They looked in front of them. What did they see? They saw the waters. They saw the sea. What did they feel? They were afraid. Behind them, in front of them, all around them, they were afraid. When you reach a point in your life where all around you you're afraid, what should you do? You must now choose. You must now decide. When the cloud moves behind the Israelites, when the Israelites are now face to face with the sea, Israel now had to make a decision. Israel must now choose. And how many options did they have? Well, you could say at least two. One option was to go back. To go back. That's why they told Moses, why did you bring us here? Wouldn't it have been better to remain in Egypt? We would have been slaves, but at least we would have been alive. So one option is to go back to the familiar, even if the familiar is slavery. One option is to go back to the familiar, even if the familiar is slavery. What's the second option? To move forward. To move forward. What's the risk? They could drown and die. Why do it? What's the potential gain? freedom and new life. But you won't know if there's freedom and new life at the other end unless you risk death by crossing the sea. And I think this is the drama of all of our lives. And I think this is the drama of the Exodus narrative. At every point in our life, we have two options. One option is to go back to the familiar, even if the familiar is slavery. The other option is to move forward, risk death, to see whether there's life and freedom at the other end. I said that in class once, and a student raised her hand. And the student said, "But sir, don't both options mean death?" "But sir, don't both options mean death?" And I told the student, that's an excellent question. And all I could answer to the student was, I think there's a dying that's diminishing, but I also think there's a dying that's a path to new life. Each of us must choose our own dying. There is a dying that is diminishing, but there is also a dying that is a path to new life. Each of us must choose our own dying. For the Christians among us, we have just come out of Lent and the Holy Week. And I think this point speaks very meaningfully about what the passion, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus means. There is a dying that is diminishing, but there is also a dying that's a path to new life. Our sixth insight: the change happens only when we are willing to leave the familiar that enslaves behind. And Pope Francis and all of us know that it's not easy. Pope Francis will say, newness often makes us fearful, including the newness which God brings us, the newness which God asks of us. Dear brothers and sisters, we are afraid of God's surprises. God always surprises us. The Lord is like that. Why is it difficult to leave the familiar? Because to do so, one will have to open oneself to the new. And the new is always a risk. Newness, as Pope Francis will say, often makes us fearful. There is this lovely poem from Joyce Rupp. Before Google Maps and Waze, there were maps. And here she will talk about old maps and the invitation to let go of them. I keep pulling it out, the old map of my inner path. I squint closely at it, trying to see some hidden road that maybe I've missed. But there's nothing there now except some well-traveled paths. They have seen my footsteps often, held my laughter, caught my tears. I keep going over the old map, but now the roads lead nowhere. A meaningless wilderness where life is dull and futile. Toss away the old map, she says. You must be kidding, I reply. She looks at me with Sarah eyes and repeats, toss it away. It's of no use where you're going. I have to have a map, I cry, even if it takes me nowhere. I can't be without direction. But you are without direction, she says. So why not let go? Be free. So there I am, tossing away the old map, sadly, fearfully, putting it behind me. Whatever will I do? Wails my security. Trust me, says my midlife soul. No map, no specific directions, no this way ahead or take a left. How will I know where to go? How will I find my way? No map. But then my midlife soul whispers, there was a time before maps when pilgrims traveled by the stars. There was a time before maps when pilgrims traveled by the stars. It is time for the pilgrim in me to travel in the dark, to learn to read the stars that shine in my soul. I will walk deeper into the dark of my night. I will wait for the stars, trust their guidance, and let their light be enough for me. I will walk deeper into the dark of my night. I will wait for the stars, trust their guidance, and let their light be enough for me. There is enough light for the next step. We have to take that step into the light for new light to accompany us along the way. We must look to the stars. Look to the deepest longings that reside in our hearts. We return to the story, and this will say that the Israelites cross finally, with the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Father Jean-Louis Ska, this Jesuit Old Testament biblical scholar, he will teach us and say, you know, the word right in Hebrew is the word yamin. And yamin also means south. The word left in Hebrew is the word semol, and semol also means north. And his interpretation is, he will ask us, what does it mean if Israel crossed the sea with the south to their right and the north to their left? And he proposes this interpretation. He says, you know, if the Israelites had the south to their right and the north to their left when they crossed the sea, then they were traversing from west to east. No? The direction of their travel was from west to east. You might ask, so what? I mean, what does that mean? And Father Ska will say, you know, in the ancient Near East, the east was the gate of life, the place where light, the sun, defeats darkness and death. The west was the entrance into the underworld, the world of darkness, of death, and of evil. And he ends with this point. No? He says, therefore, if the Israelites were traveling from west to east, they were traversing and fighting the forces of death, the forces of darkness and evil, the forces of their desires to be born unto a new life at dawn. What does the Exodus mean? It was a journey from slavery to freedom, from darkness to light, from death to new life. If that is what Exodus means, then as we said at the very beginning, Exodus is not just Israel's story. It is also the story of each and every one of us. For each of us, the journey is a journey from slavery to freedom, darkness to light, death to new life. Once again, quotes from psychology and from spirituality. James Hollis will say, growing up requires two practices. First, we must take responsibility for ourselves and stop blaming others. The society, the parents, the partner, the malevolent gods. And you see so much scapegoating all around us. No? Second, Hollis will say we have to look within to see the repetitive core ideas, the complexes, and the historic influences where the true enemy lies. The invitation to introspection, not to bring us to a dark place or pull us downwards, but to lead us to greater awareness so that we can discern and choose more freely, more responsibly, more lovingly. Pope Francis, dear brothers and sisters, let us not be close to the newness that God wants to bring into our lives. Are we often weary, disheartened, sad? Do we think that we won't be able to cope? Let us not close our hearts. Let us not lose confidence. Let us never give up. There are no situations which God cannot change. There is no sin which God cannot forgive if only we open ourselves to God. I love this particular quote in a very special way, where Pope Francis says, human history, our history, the history of every one of us is never finished. It never runs out of possibilities. Rather, it is always opening to the new, to what until now we had never even had in mind, to what seemed impossible. I was giving this presentation in a parish once, and when we reached this part of the presentation, an old lady raised her hand. She stood up, pointed to the screen where this quote was being shown, and she said, if this quote is true, then I am only beginning. If this quote is true, then I am only beginning to live my life. In her 70s, she looks at this quote and says, if this quote is true, then in a certain way, to a certain extent, we are only beginning. If you think your life is done, if you think your history is finished, Exodus is saying it is not. In a graced way, it is only beginning. And suddenly you just know it's time to start something new. And trust the magic of beginnings. I hope you can indulge me just a few more minutes to just bring things to a close. No? There's this text in Deuteronomy where the command to keep the Sabbath was very much related to the fundamental experience of the Exodus. No? And I came across this poem entitled Pandemic by Lynn Unger, where she tries to invite us to, in a sense, revisit the Sabbath. And I will end with this poem and some final reflection questions. And she says, what if you thought of it as the Jews considered the Sabbath, the most sacred of times? Cease from travel, cease from buying and selling. Give up just for now on trying to make the world different than it is. Sing, pray, touch only those to whom you commit your life. Center down. And when your body has become still, reach out with your heart. Know that we are connected in ways that are terrifying and beautiful. You could hardly deny it now. Know that our lives are in one another's hands. Surely that has come clear. Do not reach out your hands. Reach out your heart Reach out your words. Reach out all the tendrils of compassion that move invisibly where we cannot touch. Promise this world your love, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, so long as we all shall live. Promise this world your love, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, so long as we all shall live. Could this be the beginning that we are invited to embrace? As we come to the end of this journey, we revisit the 6 insights. And as I invited you to delve into these insights earlier on, I hope you can reflect on it on multiple levels. On the level of the individual, on the level of your relationships, on the level of your being part of an organization or a community or an institution, on our level as a people, as a nation, on a global level, as part of humanity. And I leave you with these 3 reflection questions. What sea is the Lord inviting you to cross? In what concrete area of your life are you being asked to move from slavery to freedom, from lethargy to generosity? Second, to what newness is the Lord inviting you? And finally, what grace would you like to beg for to help you respond to this call? I thank you for this privileged opportunity to be with you this morning. Here is a paraphrased quote from Rilke. And then the knowledge comes to me that I have space within me for a second, timeless, larger life. May we journey towards this larger life as individuals, as people in relationship, as Filipinos in our beloved Philippines, and as citizens of this one humanity. May we journey in God's grace. Salamat po.
Thank you, Sir Bong. Thank you so much for that wonderful and inspiring talk. I'm sure we have a lot of notes and we have a lot of things to think about later. I think we have some questions about, I mean, there are some people who wanted a copy of your notes. Is that possible, sir?
I have a PDF copy in slides form. I can just pass it on to you, Drea,
Yes.
if that's a convenient way to go about things.
Yes, I think that's best.
My
Okay,
email is here just in case anyone wants to write me and ask me for other things related to the talk or other things beyond it. I mean, it's Guevara at Ateneo.edu, so they can just let me know in case. No? Anyway.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope that we can continue this conversation with our PNJ community and our extended community here. But for now, we just want to say a big thank you from all of us for really touching our hearts this morning. Yes, so thank you everyone again also for joining us, and we hope to see you soon.
shared as one bread, here in our hands, here in this place. Jesus, our hope, life from the dead. In the breaking of the bread, may